There is a sound that heavy truck mechanics know the way miners know the sound of collapsing rock. It is not the roar of a diesel engine under load. It is the silence that follows when 40 tons of steel suddenly refuses to move. One moment, the engine is pulling with thousands of pounds of torque. The next, an entire operation stops. Drivers stop, mechanics gather, engineers begin making phone calls. Every passing minute costs money, reputation, and time that can never be recovered. In the world of heavy transport, a disabled truck is more than a broken machine. It is a chain reaction. Deliveries are delayed. Construction projects stand still. Recovery crews arrive with specialized equipment. Diagnostic computers are connected. Expensive replacement parts are ordered before anyone truly knows what has failed. Modern trucking has become incredibly advanced, but sometimes that complexity creates a strange problem. The more technology people depend on, the fewer people remember how to listen to a machine. That is exactly what happened during one unforgettable incident involving a Mack truck that had defeated nearly everyone who touched it. For 3 straight days, trained specialists inspected every major system. They tested electronics, checked fuel pressure, replaced components, and spent nearly $30,000 trying to bring the truck back to life. Every report pointed toward another expensive repair, yet the engine remained completely dead. By the 3rd day, confidence had disappeared. Experienced technicians had exhausted their checklists. Company managers were preparing for an even larger repair bill. Some believed the engine itself had suffered catastrophic internal damage. Others suggested hauling the truck hundreds of miles to a factory service center. No one expected a solution anymore. They were simply trying to reduce the damage. Then someone made an unexpected phone call. Not to another engineering firm, not to the manufacturer, but to an old mechanic who had spent most of his life repairing trucks long before computers became part of the job. He arrived carrying no laptop, no diagnostic scanner, and no expensive equipment. He quietly walked around the Mack, placed one weathered hand on the engine, listened for less than 3 minutes, and smiled. What happened next left experienced engineers questioning everything they thought they knew about modern machinery. The incident took place during the autumn of 2008 at a large freight terminal just outside Billings, Montana, one of the busiest transportation corridors connecting the northern Rocky Mountains with the Great Plains. Every day, hundreds of heavy trucks carrying construction equipment, timber, fuel, and agricultural products passed through the region. Delays were expensive because many loads were tied to strict delivery schedules, and every idle hour could cost thousands of dollars in penalties, labor, and missed contracts. The disabled truck was a Mack granite tandem axle tractor, powered by a modern diesel engine producing more than 450 horsepower. Built for demanding commercial work, the truck was designed to haul massive loads across steep grades, rough job sites, and long interstate routes. Like many heavy-duty trucks of its generation, it combined traditional mechanical strength with increasingly sophisticated electronic engine controls. Sensors monitored fuel pressure, airflow, timing, and dozens of other operating conditions, allowing computers to maximize efficiency and meet stricter emissions regulations. Those advances brought impressive performance, but they also introduced a new challenge. Diagnosing a problem was no longer as simple as following a fuel line or listening to an unusual vibration. Mechanics now depended heavily on electronic scanners, factory software, and technical service manuals. When those systems failed to identify the cause, even experienced technicians could find themselves replacing expensive parts simply to eliminate possibilities one by one. That was exactly what had happened here. Over 3 days, the repair team had systematically worked through nearly every logical explanation. Fuel filters were replaced, electronic sensors were tested, wiring harnesses were inspected, high-pressure fuel components were removed and checked. Each repair looked promising, yet every attempt ended the same way. The starter turned confidently, but the engine refused to fire. As the repair costs climbed toward $30,000, frustration spread across the yard. Managers faced mounting pressure from customers waiting for delayed shipments, while mechanics questioned whether the engine had suffered an internal failure that would require a complete replacement. The truck itself had become a symbol of an uncomfortable reality. Despite decades of technological progress, there were still moments when experience, intuition, and careful observation could outperform even the most advanced diagnostic equipment. That growing uncertainty set the stage for the arrival of one man whose methods belonged to an earlier generation, an era when mechanics trusted their ears as much as their tools, and when understanding a machine often mattered more than the technology used to repair it. The man who finally received the phone call was Walt Grayson, a 72-year-old retired diesel mechanic who had spent more than 5 decades working on Mack, Kenworth Peterbilt, and international trucks across Montana and Wyoming. He had never owned a large repair shop or managed a fleet. Instead, he built a reputation that spread the old-fashioned way, one successful repair at a time. Drivers trusted him because he solved problems that others walked away from. Walt belonged to a generation of mechanics who learned long before diagnostic computers became common. As a teenager, he rebuilt worn-out diesel engines alongside his father in a small roadside garage. Every strange vibration, every change in exhaust smoke, every unusual sound became part of his education. He believed a machine always gave clues. The challenge was having enough patience to notice them. Even after retiring, Walt followed the same routine every morning. He drank coffee before sunrise, repaired small equipment for neighbors when they needed help, and spent afternoons restoring an old Mack B series truck that had been sitting in his barn for decades. He never rushed. He often said that the fastest repair usually started with slowing down. Across the freight yard stood his complete opposite. A team of factory-trained engineers and experienced technicians had already invested 3 exhausting days into the disabled Mack. They arrived with laptops, diagnostic software, pressure gauges, electronic service manuals, and thousands of dollars worth of specialized equipment. Every procedure followed manufacturer guidelines. Every failed test led to another expensive replacement. Their confidence rested on technology, data, and systematic elimination. Walt relied on something different. He trusted observation before assumption. The engineers believed the truck's problem had to be hidden inside a sophisticated electronic or hydraulic system because modern failures usually were. Walt believed that before replacing expensive components, a mechanic should first prove that the simple things were impossible. To him, complexity often distracted people from obvious answers. The conflict was never personal. Both sides wanted the truck running again, but they represented 2 completely different philosophies. One believed the latest technology always produced the correct answer. The other believed experience, patience, and understanding how a machine behaved under real conditions could reveal what computers sometimes overlooked. As Walt slowly walked toward the silent Mack, the repair crew watched with quiet skepticism. Most assumed the old mechanic would simply confirm what they already knew, that the truck needed a major repair. None of them imagined that within the next 3 minutes, everything they believed about the breakdown was about to change. By the time Walt arrived at the freight terminal, the Mack truck had become the center of attention. Mechanics from nearby shops had stopped by to offer opinions. Fleet managers had reviewed repair estimates. Even experienced drivers gathered around the yard during breaks, each convinced they knew what had gone wrong. Yet, despite dozens of theories, the truck remained exactly where it had stopped 3 days earlier. The engineers were confident they had followed every logical step. The electronic control module showed no critical fault that explained the failure. Fuel pressure readings appeared normal. The batteries were fully charged. The starter turned the engine without hesitation, and several expensive sensors had already been replaced as a precaution. Thousands of dollars had been spent eliminating possibilities, but every new part only deepened the mystery. When someone suggested calling Walt, a few technicians exchanged doubtful looks. They respected his reputation, but many believed heavy trucks had changed too much since his working years. Modern diesel engines relied on electronics, emission systems, and computer-controlled timing. This was no longer the era when a mechanic could solve every problem with a wrench, a flashlight, and years of experience. One younger engineer quietly remarked, "If the factory software can't identify the fault, what exactly is he going to do?" No one answered. The question reflected what many were thinking. Walt noticed the silence as he approached the truck, but it did not bother him. He had experienced the same reaction many times before. People often assumed age meant outdated knowledge, forgetting that every new machine was still built upon the same mechanical principles. Air, fuel compression, and timing had not changed. Only the tools used to measure them had. Without speaking much, Walt asked only one question. "Tell me exactly what happened before it stopped." Instead of receiving one clear answer, he heard 5 different versions. One driver blamed contaminated fuel. Another suspected a failed injector. An engineer believed an electronic control unit had failed internally. A service manager thought the high-pressure fuel system had collapsed. Everyone had an explanation. No one had proof. That was the real problem. The truck had become buried beneath assumptions. Every failed repair encouraged another, more expensive theory. Confidence slowly disappeared, replaced by frustration and guesswork. Walt simply nodded, climbed onto the step beside the engine, and rested his hand against the metal without touching a single tool. The watching crowd exchanged puzzled glances. To them, it looked as though the old mechanic was doing absolutely nothing. In reality, he had already begun solving the problem. Walt remained silent for nearly a full minute. While everyone else watched the engine, he watched the people around it. He listened carefully to every description of what had happened during the final minutes before the truck stopped. Different details stood out to different witnesses, but Walt was searching for the one detail everyone considered too ordinary to mention. Finally, he asked the driver to climb into the cab and repeat exactly what he had done before the breakdown. No shortcuts, no summaries. Every switch, every warning light, every unusual sound. The driver hesitated, then slowly walked through the sequence from memory. As he spoke, Walt nodded only once. "Start it again," he said. The massive diesel engine cranked immediately but refused to fire. Walt wasn't disappointed. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the rhythm of the starter. The sound wasn't wrong, but it wasn't completely right either. There was a tiny hesitation that lasted less than a second, something most people would never notice beneath the noise of a heavy truck. He climbed down, opened one side panel, and shined a small flashlight deep into the engine bay. He ignored the brand new sensors the engineers had installed and looked instead at older mechanical components, hidden behind layers of hoses and wiring. Dust, vibration marks, and tiny scratches told a story that diagnostic computers could never record. One mechanic quietly whispered, "What's he looking for?" Another simply shrugged. Walt reached into his pocket and removed a small screwdriver that looked decades older than many of the people watching him. Rather than removing expensive parts, he gently pressed against a single metal linkage. It moved only a fraction of an inch before stopping. A faint smile crossed his face. "Interesting," he murmured. The engineer stepped closer. One asked politely, "Did you find something?" "Maybe," Walt replied. "Not enough to be certain." He asked for a clean shop rag and wiped away years of grease from one hidden section of the engine. Beneath the dirt, a small wear pattern became visible. It was subtle, almost invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Nobody else had noticed it during 3 days of inspections. The crowd grew quieter. For the first time since the truck had broken down, confidence began replacing doubt. The expensive repair attempts had produced nothing, yet the old mechanic had uncovered something within minutes without replacing a single component. No one knew whether his theory was correct. But for the first time, the impossible no longer seemed impossible. Walt asked everyone to step back a few feet. He made one final adjustment, tightened the small linkage by hand, and nodded toward the driver. "Try it now." The driver turned the key. The starter engaged for barely 2 seconds before the Mack engine roared to life. Thick diesel rumble echoed across the freight yard, followed by complete silence from the crowd. Mechanics who had spent 3 days searching for the fault simply stared at the truck, almost expecting it to stall again. Instead, the idle settled into a smooth, even rhythm. Walt didn't celebrate. He walked around the truck, listening carefully from different angles before asking the driver to raise the engine speed. The response was immediate. No hesitation, no warning lights, no abnormal vibration. Every gauge climbed into its normal operating range exactly as the manufacturer intended. One engineer quickly connected the diagnostic computer once more. This time, every system reported healthy operating values. Fuel pressure had returned to specification. Engine timing was stable. The electronic controls that had seemed faulty were working perfectly because the real mechanical restriction had finally been removed. The service manager looked at the repair invoices spread across the workbench. 3 days of labor, replacement sensors, new electronic modules, emergency service calls. Nearly $30,000 spent chasing symptoms instead of the actual cause. He quietly folded the paperwork. "What exactly failed?" one mechanic asked. Walt pointed toward the small linkage hidden beneath the engine components. "It wasn't broken," he explained. "It was sticking just enough to confuse every system connected to it. The computers kept reporting the effects, not the cause." Several younger technicians walked over to inspect the worn part for themselves. Now that Walt had shown them where to look, the evidence seemed obvious. The polished wear marks, the slight binding, and the tiny amount of lost movement all matched his explanation perfectly. One of the engineers smiled and admitted, "We never even checked there." Walt simply nodded. Sometimes the smallest problem hides behind the biggest symptoms. Word spread through the freight company faster than anyone expected. Drivers who had heard about the dead Mack now heard a different story. Mechanics from nearby shops stopped by, not to question Walt's methods anymore, but to ask how he had recognized the fault so quickly. The old mechanic never claimed he was smarter than the engineers. He simply reminded everyone that experience teaches you where computers rarely think to look. The Mack returned to work the very next morning, hauling freight across hundreds of highway miles without another unexpected shutdown. Weeks passed, then months, and the repair continued to hold. For the freight company, the truck became more than another vehicle in the fleet. It became a reminder that solving a problem was not always about replacing the most parts or running the most expensive tests. Sometimes it was about asking better questions. The maintenance manager quietly updated the company's inspection procedures. Alongside electronic diagnostics, mechanics were instructed to perform a complete hands-on inspection of key mechanical linkages before authorizing major component replacements. It was a simple change, but over the following years it prevented several costly misdiagnoses and saved thousands of dollars in unnecessary repairs. The younger technicians remembered something else as well. They remembered how calmly Walt had worked while everyone else rushed to find answers. He never criticized the engineers or mocked modern technology. Instead, he explained that computers were valuable tools, but tools were only as effective as the people using them. Good mechanics learned to trust both data and observation, not one at the expense of the other. As the story spread through trucking companies and repair shops, it gradually became part of local workshop conversations. Experienced mechanics used it to teach apprentices that every machine has a history hidden beneath its paint, scratches, and worn components. Those small signs often reveal more than any diagnostic screen. Several years later, one of the young engineers who had questioned Walt's methods became the lead maintenance supervisor at another freight terminal. During training sessions for new technicians, he often repeated the lesson he had learned that day. Never assume the most expensive answer is the correct one. He kept a photograph of that old Mack truck pinned to the notice board in the workshop, not because it was a famous truck, but because it represented the day experience changed his understanding of engineering. Walt never asked for recognition. He accepted no awards and gave no speeches. When people thanked him, he usually smiled and said the truck had simply told him where to look. In the end, the real lesson was never about fixing one Mack truck in 3 minutes. It was about respecting experience, staying curious when others become certain, and remembering that every great mechanic learns the same truth eventually. Machines may change with every generation. The principles that keep them running never do. Face Section 8. Emotional ending in life, lesson 400 words a years after that afternoon. The story of the silent Mack truck was still told whenever experienced mechanics gathered over coffee before a shift. The details sometimes changed with each retelling. Some claimed the truck had failed on a mountain highway. Others insisted it happened during a record-breaking freight run. But every version ended the same way. An old mechanic solved in minutes what everyone else had struggled with for days. People often remembered the 3 minutes. Few remembered the 40 years that made those 3 minutes possible. Every frozen winter morning spent repairing equipment before sunrise, every breakdown beside an empty highway, every mistake that taught a difficult lesson, and every engine carefully rebuilt by hand had quietly prepared Walt for that single moment. What looked like instinct was actually experience earned one problem at a time. The younger mechanics eventually realized that the greatest advantage Walt possessed was not sharper eyesight or better hearing. It was patience. While others rushed to prove their knowledge, he focused on understanding the machine before trying to fix it. He knew that guessing creates expensive repairs, but observation creates lasting solutions. The freight company kept the Mack in service for many more years. Drivers trusted it again because they understood that the real weakness had never been the truck itself. It had been the assumption that technology alone could answer every question. Whenever apprentices visited the workshop, senior mechanics pointed toward that familiar truck and shared one simple piece of advice: listen before you replace. Those 4 words became part of the shop's culture. They reminded every new technician that skill is measured not by how quickly parts are changed, but by how accurately the real problem is understood. Walt eventually retired, leaving behind no famous inventions, no engineering patents, and no best-selling manuals. What he left instead was something far more valuable, a way of thinking that could not be purchased, downloaded, or installed through software updates. His greatest tool had never been the screwdriver in his pocket. It had always been the years behind his eyes. The dead Mack truck became just another truck eventually. It hauled freight, wore out, and was replaced like countless others before it. But the lesson it left behind never wore out. Technology will continue to improve. Machines will become faster, smarter, and more complex. Yet every generation will eventually discover the same timeless truth. Knowledge tells you what should happen. Experience teaches you why it doesn't. And when the two work together instead of against each other, even the toughest problems become solvable.